Stories are hard to believe. They are so unlikely that they could successfully serve as a good film script. Because there's everything in them. An unpredictable hero hiding another, dark nature. Love stories, even those with a broken heart, until finally revenge. Murder, pursuit, and a spectacular court battle. But the story that I'm going to tell you today is not a piece of a movie, a book, or a comic book. It's real life, and real crimes, and the character that I'm going to bring you closer, after many years, has gained such a position in pop culture that we more and more often forget that it really existed. Today I'm going to tell you about the most famous serial killer who confessed to the murder of more than 30 women in the United States. He was a liar, a perfect manipulator, an ambitious student with an incredibly brilliant mind and a charming smile. And so he got what he wanted, but his pride and unrestricted lust led him straight to the electric chair. And he did not go down in history as the outstanding lawyer he wanted to be, but as the beast he was. Get to know the life and the crimes of Ted Bundy. His childhood began as unpredictably as most of the situations he later took part in. Theodore Robert Bundy was born on November 24, 1946, and was still named Cowell. There were times in the United States that were unfavorable to single mothers. These were immediately stamped by the public, marked with their fingers, and judged. Ted's mother, Eleanor, was 22 at the time. Only the sailor spoke of Ted's father. Her pregnancy was a surprise for a God-fearing, decent family, which, although supported the girl, was extremely strict about it. Therefore, the woman, being in her 7th month, left her family and moved to her single mother's house in Burlington, Vermont. She returned to her native Philadelphia when little Ted was already in the world. This was the beginning of a whole series of lies in which Bundy himself was directly or indirectly involved. As he grew up, he was instructed that his parents were his grandparents, to whom he was told to turn to his mom and dad. But his real mother was called his sister. But Ted, who had been an incredibly brilliant mind from an early age, already felt somewhere deep within himself that it wasn't entirely true. His suspicions became stronger when, at the age of 4, his mother packed him and moved with him to his relatives in Tacoma, Washington. If she were his sister, could she take such a little child away from her parents? It's unlikely. In Washington, Eleanor decided to create a new identity for herself and her son. She changed her name to Louise, and she changed Ted's name. From now on, his name was Ted Nelson. The boy survived his separation from his grandfather, whom he called his father. He was close to him and loved him very much, but quickly got used to the new reality. He had great contact with a cousin who was the same age as him. A true friendship was born between them, and most of the time the children spent together. Ted, as an adult man, spoke to psychologist James Dobson a few hours before his execution.
This is the tragedy of this situation, that I grew up in a decent family. There were 5. I had brothers and sisters, dedicated and loving parents for whom children were the most important. We went to church. My parents didn't drink, smoke, or gamble. There was no violence or riots.
Speaking of parents, Ted met his mother, as well as Johnny Culpepper Bundy, whom the young woman met at a party in the Methodist church. The man was a cook, but above all, someone Louise could trust. So when Ted wasn't even 5 years old, the couple decided to get married. This meant that the boy in his short life just got a 3rd name, one that almost everyone knows today, Bundy. The family bought a house near Narrows Bridge. Ted had 4 siblings, 2 brothers and 2 sisters. With his father, the boyfriend had a weak connection, although Johnny tried to make him the best he could. Nevertheless, the relationship between them was quite cool, which the man threw on the carp of Ted's difficult age. The mother quickly noticed that the eldest son had enormous potential. He was smart, he was intelligent, and he studied well. That's why she urged him to focus on getting into a good college. Ted himself had to face other challenges. In high school, he became the object of the other boys. At that time, although he was tall, he was also very thin. He didn't get caught up with a football team. He was also shy and close to himself. This made him an easy target for stronger and more confident colleagues. Ted was getting better in high school. He was quite popular and liked girls, although he still struggled with his shyness. But he made friends. He also slowly became interested in politics. He had good grades. He even received a scholarship. He did well and negotiated well. No wonder his mother had great hopes for him. But then Ted's criminal activity began. He began to balance between good and evil, between living in a community and being marginalized. In 1965, Ted was arrested at least twice by police in Pierce County. It's a car theft and a burglary. In later years, such a double life will become every day for Ted. It will create so many masks and their own identities that few will be able to indicate which one is the real one. To make money on a bicycle, Ted first worked in an energy company and later in a tarmac. In the autumn of 1966, he began his studies at the University of Washington. First, he chose the Chinese language as his target. He was convinced that this would be one of the most useful skills in the future, given the ever-expanding Chinese market. However, his ambitions quickly burned, especially as women began to play an increasing role in his life. And so it was in the spring of 1967, Stephanie Brooks appeared on Ted's way. And in reality, it's called differently, but its real name has never been revealed. Let us therefore stay with the adopted Stephanie. That's at least the nickname she used in her book. Ted Bundy, the beast next to me, and Rule, who had been friends with the killer for many years. For the man, Stephanie was meant to be the ideal he had always dreamed of. Beautiful, intelligent, from the so-called higher spheres. She embodied everything Ted was looking for in his partner. At the same time, it seemed strongly unattainable to him. After all, he was a modest student who couldn't compare himself to Stephanie's high-ranking parents. The girl was sophisticated and didn't resemble anyone he had met before. He watched her for a long time before the first meeting of his dreams occurred. Brooks drove Ted up the mountains. They both loved skiing. In this way, the couple began to spend more and more time together, and Bundy just fell in love. But in this duet, it was Ted who was much more emotionally engaged. Stephanie felt that the boyfriend was insecure. He was unable to choose a specialization in his studies, and the future with him could be unstable. The romance ended in 1968. It was a real shock for Ted. He felt that he was too unattractive to Stephanie. He did not have enough money, nor did he occupy a high social position. So it turned out what he was thinking when he saw the girl. She was just not in the league as he was. That same year, Bundy began to engage in politics. He became president of Seattle and deputy chief of state for the Rockefeller campaign. He later worked as a driver for Arthur Fletcher, a black candidate for deputy governor. In 1969, Ted decided to make sure of himself. He confirmed to the authorities that Louise was his mother. According to Rule, he also knew the name of his real father. It was Lloyd Marshall, a veteran of the Air Force. According to other sources, Bundy's father was Jack Worthington, also a war veteran. There are also theories that Ted was the fruit of his mother's unnatural relationship with his grandfather. But this theory has never been confirmed. And maybe we won't know the real name of Bundy's father anymore. At that time, Ted decided, however, that he would undergo a metamorphosis that would allow him to reclaim Stephanie and bury his complexes associated with his father's absence in life. So began Ted's mental journey, which led him more and more into dark fantasies and violent experiences. At the University of Washington, he decided to explore the secrets of psychology. And as the lecturers later confirmed, he was good at it. He had a very good degree, and one of the professors, 3 years later, being delighted with Bundy's mind, issued him recommendations to the University of Utah Law School. In September 1969, Elizabeth Kendall appeared in Ted's life, who, as Bundy himself later claimed, was at the heart of his life. The girl worked as a secretary at the University of Seattle. She was small, modest, and quiet, and she raised her 3-year-old daughter alone. The girl was the fruit of a failed marriage that Elizabeth left behind when she moved to Seattle. She met Ted at the pub, as she later, after many years, recalled. It immediately fell into her eye. He asked her to dance, and then unexpectedly spent the night at her house. When the woman woke up, Bundy took care of her daughter and prepared her breakfast. She was entirely fascinated by him. She later admitted that she met an amazing man, handsome and affectionate, who brought a new light into her life. That's how a love that lasted for many years began. In 1971, Ted started working at the emergency clinic office in Seattle. He was on night duty. Then he met Ller, who later wrote a book about him, as she is in it. It's no secret that Ted Bundy took his life, but also saved it. I was there. During his service, he received calls from people in crisis. Many of them had suicidal thoughts. Bundy spoke with them for a long time, urging them to call for help, and in many cases succeeded. He was less than 25 years old. He committed his first murder 3 years later. In 1972, Bundy became involved in political activity. He worked in the Republican state office, and he became famous in the media during the election campaign. All because of a scandal with your involvement. It turned out he was pretending to be a student and recording meetings with Democratic rival Dan Evans. As he later said, "I was circling among people and nobody had any idea who I was." Bundy was dressing up, wearing wigs, just becoming somebody else, and it gave him a lot of pleasure. Evans became governor again, and this little scandal with Ted in the lead role didn't hurt him at all. Bundy himself also won, because thanks to the victory of his candidate, his position in the political sphere increased significantly. He got a job at the Seattle City Advisory Committee on Crime Control. Despite such a good start and a chance to penetrate government structures, Bundy resigned a year later from his political career. He successfully applied for it to the Utah Law School. During that time, ironically, he also worked for the Law Department of King County, Washington, where he was preparing documentation on victims. And to think that soon he would have contributed to the increase in the number of women affected. Ted was supposed to start school in the autumn, but once again, after a burning burn, the excitement associated with the new career challenges quickly burned. Therefore, although he had long sought school admission, he did not attend lectures in autumn. Instead, he wrote a letter to the dean. He announced in it that although he was deeply sorry, he could not start school because he had a serious accident and was in the hospital. And it was only partly true. There was a collision, which resulted in his jumping joint faulted. But it did not prevent him from pursuing his studies. Bundy used to tighten up the facts so he's shown up at school. The same was true of the report on. Later it turned out that it was just an idea, not a real project in the process of implementation. In 1973, according to Ller, Bundy met Stephanie again, despite having been in a permanent relationship with Elizabeth for several years. The meeting was supposed to take place when Ted was on his way to San Francisco. He was a completely different person than he was when he met Stephanie. From an insecure, retreated boyfriend, he became an eloquent, ambitious, and well-advised former lawyer. Otherwise, he became famous. He broke in political circles, he appeared at exquisite banquets, and he had well-founded friends. Stephanie fell in love with Bundy again and planned a life together. She was convinced it'd be a year before they got married. They met for a while. And the girl didn't realize that the man was not thinking about her the same way he was a few years ago and that he was in a serious relationship with Elizabeth. Although at first, he was puzzling Stephanie, taking her to expensive dinners. Over time he began to distance himself and became cold. When the girl tried to talk about it, he replied that he had no idea what she was talking about. Later, Stephanie concluded that Bundy had planned revenge on her for all these years. After she left him, he decided to change. He gained a high position and became someone with prospects, and that's all to get Stephanie back, to fall in love with her. And when she reaches her goal and the girl gets engaged, to throw her away like she used to. Bundy never contacted her again. This led in 1974 to a series of macabre attacks and crimes that brought about a story that no one could even expect. 18-year-old Joni Lentz was sitting in a room in the basement of an old house near Washington University. It was possible to get inside from the outside through the side door. On January 4th, the girl went to bed at the same time she did it every day. When she fell asleep, an assailant entered the room. He brutally beat and mutilated her, and then, as if nothing, he left the house and disappeared into the darkness. The 18-year-old, full of blood, stayed in her bed. It was found the next day by fellow residents. Joni's in the hospital. She was alive but in critical condition. The assailant ripped out a piece of the bed frame and put the girl in the vagina, damaging internal organs, including the bladder. Joni also had brain damage, and she was in a coma for many days. When she recovered, she had to learn many things again, to speak, to walk, to function in society. She also had memory loss. She couldn't remember the 10 days before the attack. Joni herself, after many years, admitted that she, as well as many investigators, was Ted Bundy's first victim and one of the few survivors. But the first victim was 21-year-old Linda Ann Healy from Seattle. The girl worked at one of the radio stations in Washington. When she didn't show up at work in the morning without notice, everyone was surprised. Her roommate was awakened by an alarm clock that sounded all over the house just after 5 o'clock. Linda used to turn it off when she got up to work. She came to the radio by bicycle. This time, however, no one turned off the cracking signal, and the girl's bed was perfectly glazed. Like she wasn't in the room at all, the nervous search has begun. It was established that Linda had not arrived at work and her bicycle was still in the basement. The police called to the scene and entered the girl's room. It was perfectly clean, almost sterile. When the detectives discovered the blanket, they saw large spots of dried blood. The roommate admitted that the bed was glassed differently than usual. In turn, a nightshirt was found in the wardrobe, which Linda probably wore. She was bloody, too. Investigators quickly concluded that someone entered the room of the 21-year-old last night. He attacked her while she was still sleeping, then took off her clothes and quietly took her out of the house. There was no trace of the girl, and her remains were found only more than a year later. When Seattle police were trying to find out what happened to Linda, Donna Manson disappeared from Evergreen College without a trace. A 19-year-old was going to a jazz concert on campus. She entered the academy just before 19 o'clock. She was a very low and thin girl. If anyone wanted to disarm her, he'd have a bigger problem with that. Donna, however, was very intelligent. Although she frequently dropped out of class, she broke her legs and, according to her friends, she might be depressed. So the investigators initially suspected that the teenager might have committed suicide. After analyzing her records, however, the psychiatrist concluded that there was nothing there to suggest that the girl would want to take her own life. She was fascinated by death and alchemy, but as the specialist explained, the entries were typical for girls of her age and should not cause anxiety. But Donna's gone. She left all her belongings in the room, even her camera, with which she never parted. There was no conjecture, no guess, nothing. It's like it's been floating in the air. And somehow it was because Donna's body was never found. On April 17th, another student disappeared. It was 18-year-old Susan Rancourt. She's smart, she's ambitious, she practices karate. However, she was afraid of the dark, so she never left the house by herself after dark. She changed her habits only this one time, in the spring of 1974, in the evening. She took her clothes to the laundry room of one of the academics and then went to the caregivers meeting. Then she was supposed to watch the movie with her friend, but she didn't get to that meeting anymore. She didn't come back to the laundry, either. And like the two previous girls, Susan disappeared without a trace. It was then that for the first time, the stories of a mysterious, handsome man with his hand on the tapestry began to penetrate. He was seen under the library. He carried books, but he dropped them from time to time. He stuck one of the students' hand and asked her for help. There was a car parked nearby. The girl went with him, helped him pack books for the car, and then she noticed that there was no passenger seat in the vehicle. This worried the student, as she put the books in the trunk and just ran away. Does this motif remind you of something? In The Silence of the Sheep, serial killer Buffalo Bill started in a similar way to Catherine Martin. He parked a big car in front of her block and waited for the right moment. When the girl showed up in the area, Buffalo Bill, with his hand in plaster, tried to load the car seat. This one, however, fell to the ground every moment, so Catherine asked if the man needed help. She put the chair in the vehicle with him, and when she found herself inside, the killer stung her and kidnapped her. Once again, therefore, The Silence of the Sheep reached the motives and stories that happened. In this case, the inspiration was Ted Bundy. Bundy's hand on the tapestry was seen in the spring of '74 by at least a few female students. He tried to persuade one of them to get into the car and help him fire the vehicle, but each of the girls he caught ran away in a hurry. Later they said something was disturbing about the man. Although he was kind and polite, his eyes seemed empty. It made them feel uncomfortable and wanted to leave him as soon as possible. It's possible that Susan submitted to the killer's request and still got in the car with him. According to her friends, she couldn't surrender without a fight, so if there was a scarponine, there would be no trace left. But that was not the case. The 18-year-old disappeared in total darkness as if it had absorbed her. Only less than a year later were the remains of the girl found. The first 3 killings were in Washington. Another victim was from Oregon. This is 22-year-old Robert Parks. She disappeared in early May 1974. On June 1st, again, Brenda Ball disappeared in Washington. June 11th, Georgine Hawkins. All the missing girls had the same thing in common. They were young, attractive, studied, and they had long, straight hair that was chested with a compartment in the middle. Everyone was a virgin. Everyone was white, thin, intelligent, and capable. In many respects, they were so physically similar that they could successfully be considered sisters. So it seemed that the kidnapper had his type and was guided by this in the selection of victims. In the summer, however, it changed its scope. He no longer hunted for female students near the campuses but moved to a territory heavily besieged by young people. The state park of Lake Sammamish has great popularity, especially in summer, when the students were thirsty for the sun and company. They spent their free days relaxing, drinking beer, and talking together. On the 14th of July 1974, as many as 40,000 people were able to pass there. Among them was Ted Bundy. In his crimes, he became confident enough that he did not hesitate to cling to young women in the white day in a place on the shore filled with people. Again, he put on his arm, a shovel, and went hunting. Even before noon, he approached a young girl and asked her for help. As he explained, he had a problem attaching the sailing vessel to the car. The girl agreed to go with him, but when they arrived at Bundy's Point, it turned out there was no sailboat there. Then Ted was supposed to say he's on the other side of the hill, with his parents. He suggested that she get in the car and go with him to the place. The girl was touched by something, so she decently refused. Bundy didn't protest, but he wasn't going to let go. The young girl, whom he tried to drag into the car first, later testified that she saw him walking towards the parking lot. Next to him was a pretty young woman who was riding a bicycle. They talked about something lively. As it later turned out, the girl was Janice Otiti, 23 years old. She's smart, she's ambitious. She practices karate. However, she was afraid of the dark, so she never left the house by herself after dark. She changed her habits only this one time, in the spring of 1974. In the evening, she took her clothes to the laundry room of one of the academics and then went to the caregivers meeting. Then she was supposed to watch the movie with her friend, but she didn't get to that meeting anymore. She didn't come back to the laundry, either. And like the two previous girls, Susan disappeared without a trace. It was then that for the first time, the stories of a mysterious, handsome man with his hand on the tapestry began to penetrate. He was seen under the library, he carried books, but he dropped them from time to time. He stuck one of the students' hand and asked her for help. There was a car parked nearby. The girl went with him, helped him pack books for the car, and then she noticed that there was no passenger seat in the vehicle. This worried the student, as she put the books in the trunk and just ran away. Does this motif remind you of something? In The Silence of the Sheep, serial killer Buffalo Bill started in a similar way to Catherine Martin. He parked a big car in front of her block and waited for the right moment. When the girl showed up in the area, Buffalo Bill, with his hand in plaster, tried to load the car seat. This one, however, fell to the ground every moment, so Catherine asked if the man needed help. She put the chair in the vehicle with him, and when she found herself inside, the killer stung her and kidnapped her. Once again, therefore, The Silence of the Sheep reached the motives and stories that happened. In this case, the inspiration was Ted Bundy. Bundy's hand on the tapestry was seen in the spring of '74 by at least a few female students. He tried to persuade one of them to get into the car and help him fire the vehicle, but each of the girls he caught ran away in a hurry. Later they said something was disturbing about the man. Although he was kind and polite, his eyes seemed empty. It made them feel uncomfortable and wanted to leave him as soon as possible. It's possible that Susan submitted to the killer's request and still got in the car with him. According to her friends, she couldn't surrender without a fight, so if there was a scarpinine, there would be no trace left. But that was not the case. The 18-year-old disappeared in total darkness as if it had absorbed her. Only less than a year later were the remains of the girl found. The first 3 killings were in Washington. Another victim was from Oregon. This is 22-year-old Robert Parks. She disappeared in early May 1974. On June 1st, again, Brenda Ball disappeared in Washington. June 11th, Georgine Hawkins. All the missing girls had the same thing in common. They were young, attractive, studied, and they had long, straight hair that was chested with a compartment in the middle. Everyone was a virgin, everyone was white, thin, intelligent, and capable. In many respects, they were so physically similar that they could successfully be considered sisters. So it seemed that the kidnapper had his type and was guided by this in the selection of victims. In the summer, however, it changed its scope. He no longer hunted for female students near the campuses but moved to a territory heavily besieged by young people. The state park of Lake Sammamish has great popularity, especially in summer, when the students were thirsty for the sun and company. They spent their free days relaxing, drinking beer, and talking together. On the 14th of July 1974, as many as 40,000 people were able to pass there. Among them was Ted Bundy. In his crimes, he became confident enough that he did not hesitate to cling to young women in the white day in a place on the shore filled with people. Again, he put on his arm, a shovel, and went hunting, even before noon. He approached the young girl and asked her for help. As he explained, he had a problem attaching the sailing vessel to the car. The girl agreed to go with him, but when they arrived at Bundy's Point, it turned out there was no sailboat there. Then Ted was supposed to say he's on the other side of the hill, with his parents. He suggested that she get in the car and go with him to the place. The girl was touched by something, so she decently refused. Bundy didn't protest, but he wasn't going to let go. The young girl, whom he tried to drag into the car first, later testified that she saw him walking towards the parking lot. Next to him was a pretty young woman who was riding a bicycle. They talked about something lively. As it later turned out, the girl was Janice Otiti, 23 years old. She was alone by the lake that day. She was wearing jeans shorts and a white shirt. Bundy approached her and asked for help in loading the sailing vessel. He insisted on her for a moment. After a few minutes, the girl agreed and went with the man. No one ever saw her again. On the same day, on the 14th of July, only a few hours later, 18-year-old Denise Neslin also disappeared on the lake. The girl was with her friends. About 16:30, she got up to go to the bathroom. And then the trace of her disappeared. The disappearances of young women have reached the media. Witnesses testified that on that day there was a young, handsome man in the crowd, with his hand on a tapestry, who portrayed himself as Ted. A memorial portrait was also made. Unfortunately for the police, there were no special signs on the man's face that would distinguish him from the other suspects. He had a fairly ordinary face, some of the features of which could be attributed to more than one person. However, some delicate accents appeared, which later merged into a coherent whole. Witnesses testified that the mysterious Ted seemed to be educated, well-known, hot, and had a car. A bronze Volkswagen, but that was still not enough to name a specific person. At least that's what it seemed to the investigators. Because there was one person whose drawing reminded me of somebody. In her lush hair and thick eyebrows, she noticed her boyfriend's face. Although at first, she tried to discard that idea. That woman was Elizabeth Kendall, Ted Bundy's partner. Meanwhile, Ted was preparing to move to Salt Lake City. He was supposed to start his law studies there. It meant breaking up with Elizabeth, but they decided to try to be a couple at a distance. The relationship between them has cooled down. Ted became cool, but he was convinced that it was the result of work-related stress. Elizabeth suspected she might be cheating on her with other women. She also increasingly reached for alcohol. Several people their suspicions about Bundy, but after checking, the police removed him from the list of potential kidnappers. But death followed Ted everywhere he moved. When he was in Jude, 16-year-old Nancy Wilcox disappeared. On October 18th, the same fate encountered 17-year-old Melissa Smith, the daughter of the chief of the Midway Police. Her body was found 9 days later. She was brutally beaten, and her head was torn. The cause of death was suffocation. The girl's neck was strapped with a stocking. She was also, on October 31st, 1974, on Halloween, Ller disappeared. The girl came in from the party and just disappeared. Her body was found by accidental passers. Like Melissa, the girl was also beaten and strangled. The news of the murders has reached the media. Elizabeth Kendall was getting more and more suspicious. She was so worried that she decided to contact the police. She shared her doubts, but they were not taken seriously. So the name of the gang was once again ignored. On November 8th, Ted wasn't so lucky anymore. Something happened that burdened him heavily in his later investigation. It was a rather gloomy and rainy day. 18-year-old Carol Derrinch went to a shopping mall in the suburbs of Mary, Utah. While she was in the bookstore, a smiling, handsome man approached her. He asked if it was her car in front of the store. She said yes. Then he said he was a cop and they just stopped someone trying to break into the vehicle. He asked if the girl would go with him and see if anything had disappeared from the car. I'm not sure, but Carol agreed to check if everything was okay with the car. Once on the spot, she quickly glanced inside and told the stranger that nothing had disappeared. Then the man offered to go with him to the police station because there was a thief who hadn't arrived. Carol was getting more and more suspicious. She asked the stranger for her identity. He said his name was Rosalind. He struck her with his wallet in front of her eyes, as if there were a police ID and a badge, and then again offered to go with him to the station. Despite the uncertainty, Carol agreed, although she had the impression that she felt alcohol from the man. Panic overwhelmed her when the driver moved abruptly and didn't drive towards the police station at all. In Ted Bundy's documentary Falling for a Killer, she said,
"When I was in the car, I realized I was wrong. Suddenly he moved. He got on the edge. Then I panicked. I remember yelling at him. Nothing answered, but I saw a change in him. He pulled out his gun and said, 'I'll break your head.' I thought, please, I'd die on the spot. But I felt I had to fight. Get away at all costs. I opened the door and I got out on the street, and he came out for me. I remember he had a fracture in his hand. He tried to hit me in the head. It wasn't easy. A car arrived, and I jumped into it.
In this way, Charles managed to avoid the nightmare fate of his previous girlfriends murdered by Bundy, but after this unsuccessful kidnapping, he had no intention of giving up. He was like a furious and saturated animal to whom hunger sends a healthy perception of reality. He knew he had to kill somebody, even if he had made such a terrible mistake a moment earlier. So when Charles' alarmed police arrived at the place she managed to escape, Bundy's car was gone. He went hunting for another victim, and he found her. That same evening he arrived at Bundyville. There was a performance at the school there. Behind the scenes, a stranger grabbed a young teacher. As in the case of Carol, also here he tried to persuade a woman to go identify the car, but the teacher refused. She didn't know who he was and why he was asking her for help. She proposed to bring her husband, and then Bundy gave up any further insistence. Debbie Kent wasn't so lucky. The teenager was also at the show. She proposed to her parents that she would pick up her brother from the glacier, and then they would go back to school for them. They agreed, but Debbie never reached the iceberg. She didn't come back to the show either. The parents were waiting for her in front of the building, but the daughter was not coming. Concerned people called the police, but Debbie just disappeared. Individual witnesses said that between 22 and 23 they heard a scream, and one saw a Volkswagen Beetle rushing out of the parking lot, but the officers didn't have anything else. Debbie seems to have fallen to the ground, and her body has never been found. Nevertheless, the parents did not lose faith, and every day since the daughter's disappearance they lit a lamp in front of the house to let Debbie know that they were still waiting for her. On January 12, 1975, a graduate nurse, Karen Campbell, was on vacation in Aspen, Colorado. She was accompanied by her fiancé, cardiologist Raymond Godofsky, and two of his children. When they were sitting at 4 o'clock in the guest house lounge, the woman remembered that she had left a magazine in her room, so she went to the elevator, warning her partner she'd be back soon. However, this has not happened. Karen disappeared on her way to room 210. When she didn't show up for a long moment, Raymond went into the room by himself, but there was nobody there, not so much. Everything indicated that the woman had not reached the place at all. The magazine she went for was still lying on the rack. At about 22 o'clock, Godofsky called the police in Aspen. The search for a nurse has begun. The entire building was searched, including the windshields, but the woman was nowhere. Nobody saw her either. Until January 18th, then a resort worker found the naked body of the nurse a few kilometers from the guest house where she was staying. The section revealed that she died from a skull injury. She also died shortly after leaving the living room where she was with her fiancé. It meant that she stumbled on her liner in the corridor between the elevators and room 210. Colorado was the third state Bundy killed when he left Washington and Utah. The disappearances of young women ceased. In Colorado, the nightmare was just beginning. Julie Cunningham disappeared on the 15th of March, Dennis Oliverson on the 6th of April, Melanie Cooley on the 15th of April, and Shelley Robertson on the 1st of July. And just as suddenly a series of disappearances and murders began, it ended just as violently, just like the luck of Bundy himself. On August 16, 1975, Sergeant Bob Hayward, a 22-year-old highway officer, came to his house. Then he noticed a Volkswagen Beetle passing by. He didn't associate the car, and he knew everyone around. Besides, the driver didn't turn on the lights. So he followed the vehicle, but then the Volkswagen Beetle accelerated. The pursuit has begun, finally. The car went down to the parking lot of an abandoned gas station. The sergeant stopped right behind him. When he approached the driver, he replied, "I think I'm lost." But the cop got suspicious. He asked for papers, and then he started asking Bundy what he was doing in the area. He stated that he came to the car theater to watch the movie Burning Tower, and when he returned, he lost his orientation in the field. But the cop already knew the man was lying. There was no Burning Tower on that day. Hayward was joined by his second road patrol. He already knew he was in trouble. The policeman noticed that the passenger's seat had been disassembled and there was a fracture behind the driver's chair. In addition, bags full of items that could be useful during the break-in were found in the vehicle. Ironing machine, ice pen, headlamp, gloves, tights, mask, rope and wire. So the sergeant arrested Bundy for running away from a police officer. The investigators started slowly linking the threads. The cages found in Ted's house were of the same production that Carol Dorich had put on his wrist. The girl was threatened with a break, and the break in her car was Bundy's. It also fits the drawing. But Ted himself seemed distracted by the arrest, and he was convinced that he could find an explanation for every connection that the cops would present. His apartment has been searched. We found a map showing resorts and ski routes in Colorado. Ted was convinced that he himself had never been to the area, and the map must have belonged to a colleague. Apart from her, the police found nothing that could be used as evidence of the attempted kidnapping of Charles or the disappearance of Melissa, Lori, or Deborah. Bundy's photo shows Jean Graham, a teacher who was struck by a man during a school performance. She recognized him right away. They also asked for credit card excerpts to check where the car was refueling. His fiancée, Elizabeth Kendall, was also contacted. The woman was already in absolute disintegration. Suspicions about her lover didn't give her peace. She felt anxious, even though she always explained to herself that her partner couldn't hurt anyone. He was caring for her daughter, who he helped raise. And although their relationship cooled, she did not give up her dreams of living together and marriage. Sometimes she pretended to herself that she would allow such thoughts to come into her head, but she was constantly afraid. Somewhere she subconsciously knew that not everything in Ted's stories was true. That's why she started working with the police. During talks with officers, she admitted that her partner often disappeared at night. Later, he dropped it in the day. In addition, she encountered objects whose origin she was unable to explain. For example, a key to the wheels glued with a ribbon under the car seat, modeling plaster, and balls. More importantly, Ted wasn't with her on any of the nights that the girls were missing in Washington. Everything Elizabeth said was very disturbing, and it merged into a coherent whole. The black clouds were thickening over Ted's head, although he seemed to be completely unaware of it. He was convinced that he would soon be released, and he did not realize that police from Washington, Utah, and Colorado were looking for evidence to link him to the disappearances of young women. After checking Bandy's cards, it was discovered that he was tanking a car near the sites where Karen, Julie, and Dennis disappeared. Ted was obsessively watching to keep him from running out of fuel on his long journeys, and that lost him. His visits to the gas stations were a kind of map of trips that coincided with the murder points. This man will be one of many who will appear in the later Bundy trial. There were more and more witnesses, including those who saw Ted on Lake Sammamish. Ted was driving a car, and a few people pointed to a car like that. It fit the drawing, often imitated the British accent, and had suspicious objects, including plaster and a bullet. And yet the man wanted in Washington was precisely by pretending to be a disabled attracting his victims. And more importantly, he didn't have an alibi. And everywhere he showed up, a young woman disappeared. At that time, Bundy was already under arrest in Salt Lake City. A group of friends were collecting money for a bail for him. All his friends were convinced that there was a terrible mistake, and the intelligent, smiling Ted became the accidental victim of this confusion. On the 20th of November, he went out on bail, but he was not completely free. Everywhere he moved, he had the watchful eyes of the cops behind him. They had insufficient evidence to charge him, and the very facts and their assumptions would be crushed in court, so they had to wait. In January '76, Ted was charged with attacking and kidnapping Charles Dorich. The girl recognized him in the pictures. The trial started at the end of the month. It was then that the name Bundy appeared in the media for the first time on a larger scale. But the trial wasn't easy for Carol. So the Colorado authorities were preparing to charge Ted with the murder of a nurse. The charges were filed on the 22nd of October 1976. It was also decided to extradite Bundy to Colorado. He was scheduled to leave Utah on January 28, 1977. That's what happened. However, he was treated well in custody there. He didn't have to wear a robe in court. He also had good contact with the guards. Some investigators were dissatisfied with this and signaled that Bundy could escape, even in Utah. He was found with a set that could help him with his early release, but these signals were ignored. Ted fired his current lawyers and decided to defend himself. In April, he was transferred to Garfield County Detention Center in Glenwood Springs. There he also found favorable people. He made good contact with the sheriff, and because he defended himself, he was allowed to use the law library in Aspen. He could walk between the shelves and reach any position. He was treated not as an accused, but as a lawyer, and he intended to take advantage of that. On June 7, 1977, Bundy was transferred to the Pitkin County Court. During the interruption, he was allowed to use the library. And then Ted realized his plan, which he had been preparing for a long time. He took advantage of the moment when he was completely alone, opened the window, and jumped out. The hall was on the first floor, so he damaged his right leg during the fall. That didn't stop him from escaping. He started running. Later, he slowed down so he couldn't pay attention to himself. His absence was soon discovered, but Bundy was able to get acquainted with the city's distribution during a trip to court, so he put the whole scenario in his head. He put another set of clothes under the clothing he was wearing during the hearing. Later, he abandoned the upper layer near the river. The police, shocked by Bundy's behavior, had to take action. The roads have been blocked, and the dogs have been removed. Officials were convinced that he would not get out of the city, especially on foot. Meanwhile, the fugitive was already at the foot of the mountains. It was cold and rainy, and Bundy was only wearing his pants and a thin shirt. Still, he didn't intend to give up. He ran into an abandoned cottage and took refuge there. Inside, he found some food and warm clothes. When he got strong, he decided to move on. The cops got to the cottage, but Bundy wasn't there anymore. He was in town again, where he decided to steal the car. To his joy, he discovered that the keys were left in the parked vehicle. So he got in and went ahead of him. He's been out for 6 days. He was exhausted, sick, and hungry, so his ride was uncertain. It was noticed by the policemen who patrolled the street at the time. They stopped the vehicle, and one of them immediately met Bundy. He said, "Hi, Ted." That's how the first, but not the last, escape of the killer ended. Bundy was arrested again. In the footage, you can see that after this adventure he lost a lot of weight, and was also slapped. Nevertheless, the smile did not disappear from his face, especially when he saw the journalists. His escape was a real sensation, and a strong cheek for the police. There were mutual accusations of treating Bundy too badly, who was accused of serious crimes. It was decided that he would no longer have privileges. He was well guarded in custody. And yet again, he's overtaken the police and the guards, being in the lockdown. He was perfectly acquainted with the construction of the building. He ate too little and lost 63 kilos. There was a metal tile in the ceiling of his cell. It was supposed to be replaced by a ceiling. For a few weeks, Bundy used a small ball to cut a tile and did it completely unnoticed. When everything had already been prepared, the hole was ready, and he was thin enough, he began to wait for the right moment to escape. This one came on December 30th. He pushed himself through the hole, and he was attached to the bodyguard's apartment, Bob Morrison. There, when he made sure that no one was there, he changed his clothes and went out the front door. At that time, nobody even assumed that Bundy was no longer in the cell and he was heading for freedom again. After dinner, no one came in, so Ted was perfectly aware that he would have a few hours of advantage over the cops. When he was outside, he found a car with keys inside. He got in there and left Glenwood Springs. On the way, the car refused to obey him, so Bundy caught the opportunity at about 4 a.m. and got to the station. There he had a bus to Denver. He was already in town at 8:30. He got on a plane that was flying to Chicago. And imagine, even then, nobody knew his Bundy wasn't in the cell. It was only discovered at lunchtime, 17 hours after the spectacular escape. Panic broke out, blocks were set, and dogs were brought in, but Ted was not one step ahead of the cops, but 2,000 kilometers. It was a gap. Bundy was on the FBI's list of most wanted criminals, and the media about Ted's next unlikely feat. He decided that he would sow himself somewhere, gain a new identity, and not break the law so as not to be exposed to capture. But the need to do evil was stronger than him. He chose Tallahassee in Florida for his purpose. That's where he took the name Chris Hagen. Later he decided to be a student, Kenneth Missner. He made the paperwork and rented a room on campus. He started stealing, too, bicycles, food or cosmetics. Because he had only $60 on him, and that's not enough to survive, especially when you didn't have a job. Then he was filming near the university. He pretended to be a student. He came to some classes, and he used the gym, but no one paid attention to him. He was entirely anonymous, which was very appropriate for him at the time. He focused his eyes on Chiomega. It was a house inhabited by female students. There were 39 capable and competent young women there. Bundy, despite a promise to himself of a life in harmony with the law, gave himself to his obsession with killing people. And he did a real massacre. It all happened on the night of January 14th to January 15th. 2 weeks after Bundy escaped from prison. Ted broke into an room with a couple of girls, and there he brutally beat them. Lisa Levy, 20, and Margaret Bowman, 21, were strangled. They also had bodies massacred. Lisa's right ear was almost bitten off. On her buttock was a clear print of teeth. She was licked, and her pants lay next to the bed. She was with a bottle. Margaret, in turn, had a scratched head. She was lying on her bed with a large stain of blood. It was surrounded by fragments of bark. Bundy attacked them with a bowl he found in front of the academician. He hit Margaret so hard that pieces of bone got into her brain. She was strangled with socks that had to be literally cut off from her neck. Corinne Chandler and Kathy Kleiner were also brutally beaten. But the girls were more fortunate and they managed to survive. The first student had a broken jaw, teeth broken, and probably a cranium broken. The same was the case with Kathy. But none of the girls were able to explain what actually happened that night. They were attacked suddenly, in a dream. They didn't have a chance to defend themselves. The attack lasted only 15 minutes. It meant that the killer acted in absolute shame, as if he wanted to unload all the emotions that had been in him for months. Even after Bundy was arrested, he said of his crimes,
"You can't describe this brutal urge to do that. When it was all over, that impulse was satisfied, and all the energy was already exhausted at the normal level. I was myself again. I was a normal person. I had good friends, I lived a normal life. Except for the only destructive field I kept secret. Just for yourself. I felt like I was coming out of some terrible trance or dream. I don't want to dramatize too much, but I would compare it to being possessed by some alien power. The next day, a man wakes up, remembers what he has done, and is aware that he is responsible before the law and before God. I woke up in the morning aware of what I had done, and all the ethical rules I had broken. I'm scared of being capable of something like that."
But he was capable of horrendous things, and the same night, when he carried out the massacre in Chiomega, other people were convinced of it. Bundy moved from college to the 8 blocks away house where a student, Cheryl Thomas, lived. He broke into her room, where he beat her and mutilated her. She had serious head injuries. Her skull was broken in 5 places. The girl lost her hearing in her left ear. She spent a month in the hospital. But Bundy had no intention of stopping that nightmare. Imbued with his arrogance, he decided to find another victim. The opportunity came on February 8, 1978, in Jacksonville, where he got away with a stolen van. He caught 14-year-old Leslie Parmenter. He introduced himself as Richard Barton of the fire service. Luckily for the girl, there was a brother who chased Bundy. This irritated, but also unsaturated, already the next day chose another target. It was Kimberly Leach, who was only 12 years old. He kidnapped a girl when she was still in school, during class. She went to one of the halls to get her backpack. That's when Bundy kidnapped her. Then he the girl and murdered her, and left her body in the barracks. The remains of the child were found only in April. Kimberly Leach was Ted Bundy's last victim. The brutal activity of the killer came to an end on February 15th. Bundy stole another car. He was circling the area at night. He was noticed by a police officer from Pensacola, David Lee. This slow driving of the driver seemed suspicious to him, so he decided to check it. He contacted the station and asked to check the registration numbers. It quickly turned out that the car had been stolen. Lee turned on the police sirens and followed the vehicle. This one, however, accelerated. The pursuit has begun, but it didn't last long because Bundy stopped, but he wasn't going to give up easily. When the cop approached him, there was a scratch. Ted tried to escape, but then the cop shot him. He didn't hit him, but after the shot, Bundy fell to the ground and Lee was able to stop him. Then Ted was supposed to tell him, "Sorry you didn't kill me." Bundy's in custody. That's where he put a false name. This was quickly verified, however, but Ted refused to provide the true identity. He tried to play on time. He knew what would happen when he revealed who he was. He was allowed to make a few calls. He also talked to a lawyer. He also asked for a meeting with the priest. Finally, during the hearing, he confessed, "I'm Ted Bundy." He immediately became the #1 suspect in the brutal murder of two students from Chi Omega. The killer's only waiting for trial. The one related to the massacre at the academy began on June 25, 1979, in Miami. It was the biggest event in the history of American television. For the first time, the trial was to be in its entirety, and media from all over the country sought access to the court. Bundy had 5 lawyers at his disposal, but he did not intend to use their help. He decided to take a move that everyone dissuaded him. You can't be a defender in your case, but Bundy was incredibly confident. He was convinced of his genius and legal intelligence. He was entering the room holding thick bags and smiling widely at the media. He even decided to question witnesses. At that time, however, his lack of experience was often revealed, and the court repeatedly rejected his questions. Bundy was making a lot of noise around him. He was arrogant and he was often carried with emotions. There was evidence against him. This is primarily the testimony of Nita Nera, a student who, during the tragic night at Chi Omega, saw Bundy coming out of the building. The prints of his teeth were also matched to the traces left on the buttock of the murdered Lisa. They fit perfectly. The jury had no doubts. She found Ted guilty of the death of 2 students from Chi Omega. He was sentenced to death for this. By that time, Bundy's relationship with Elizabeth Kendall had long since broken up. It was revealed by Carol and Bone, a former friend of Ted, who began to appear in all his lectures. She quickly reached the media as one of the most ardent supporters of the murderer. She defended him fiercely and somehow acted as his spokeswoman. She convinced him that he was innocent, and she'd help him prove it in court. She was supposed to have a relationship with Bundy. The woman was fascinated by Ted and did not intend to leave him even when all the evidence indicated his guilt. Grotesque events occurred in 1980 in Orlando, where another trial against Bundy was ongoing. This time he was responsible for the death of 12-year-old Kimberly Leach. After searching the car abandoned by Bundy, a lot of evidence was found that the man was carrying the girl, among other things. It was the blood of the same group as the baby and the fibers that came from Kim's shirt. When Ted once again acted as his defender, Carol declared herself and married her. The woman even moved to Florida to be closer to her lover. He was found guilty of killing Kim and sentenced to another death penalty. Therefore, it is difficult to imagine a more macabre moment for marriage. According to the police from Pensacola and Tallahassee, who interrogated Ted after he was arrested by David Lee, Bundy told them in detail about his crimes. One memorable night, when he revealed his identity, according to the officials, he gained honesty, as if he wanted to drop a burden. When asked how many people he killed, he replied, "Add one digit and you'll have the result." At the time, Bundy was suspected of at least 36 murders. His answer, however, may have suggested that there could have been 100 of these murders. The exact number is not known, however, after many years of persistent denial of murders, Bundy finally admitted to taking the lives of 30 people. The identity of 20 of them has been confirmed. Ted Bundy was sent to Florida State Prison after the sentence was announced. He was regularly visited in the cell by his wife, who gave him a daughter in 1982. The couple tried to live their lives as if they were free. They sent cards to friends, posed for photos, and spent Christmas together in prison. By his appearance, but also a certain eloquence, Bundy had incredible success among women. He received 200 letters from fans every day. They were drawn by the darkness that surrounded him. They clung to him like ants to the fire. That could explain why Ted was so easily manipulated by his victims. The day before the execution, Bundy gave his last interview. He talked to psychologist James Dobson. He was convinced that had a big impact on who he was and what he was doing. He got into her when he was a kid.
From my difficult and personal experience, the most harmful is pornography, which combines violence with sexual violence. The combination of these two forces, and few know it as well as I do, leads to behavior so horrible that it's hard to describe.
According to Bundy, he was extremely susceptible to images contained in pornographic content. These were meant to distort his view of sex and women. At the same time, he was convinced that this was not the only reason for this and not a different view of the world. However, he was an important factor. The sentence was due to be executed on the 24th of January 1989. A few hours before the execution, Bundy said,
"I'm not going to pretend to be in control of the situation or that I've accepted that idea. It's not. It's different. Sometimes I feel very quiet and confused. What's going on in my mind? I'm trying to spend the last hours and minutes as fruitfully as possible and see what happens next."
Ted believed he would avoid the death penalty. However, this has not happened. The verdict was executed as scheduled on the 24th of January at 7:06. Ted Bundy was executed in an electric chair. His death was confirmed at 7:16. Hundreds of people gathered in front of the Florida State Prison and began to celebrate after Bundy's death was announced. There were petards, screams, applause, and singing. Ted Bundy was 42 at the time of his death. To this day, he remains the most famous and brutal serial killer in the world. He shot the public mainly because he seemed to be an ordinary, intelligent guy from the neighborhood. He was handsome, smiling, and ambitious. During the study, it was found that his intelligence ratio was 124. He was like a chameleon. He was able to take the form he wanted at the time. His friend, and Rule, said after years, he was completely different to everyone. He was an actor, a liar, a thief, a murderer, a twist, an intruder, a seducer, an intelligent, but not a genius, and a cursed man. I don't think Ted himself knew what he was.